Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you. My name is Joseph White. I am a child and family psychologist and director of catechetical resources for our Sunday Visitor Publishing. I'm especially thrilled to be talking with you about helping kids stay Catholic. This is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. I have a lot to share with you today, so I hope that I can get all of this in. I want to just mention a couple of things as we get started here. One is that you can contact me at the website that's on the screen right now, sharingcatholicfaith.com, sharingcatholicfaith.com, and I'm going to post my notes from this presentation there after this as well. It's on the 2020 calendar page. If you scroll underneath the dates there, many of which have been canceled because of COVID, underneath the dates you'll see some presentations linked. This presentation will be there. I also want to invite you to connect with me via my Twitter and Facebook accounts. Those buttons are on the home page as well. There is where I share items that would be of interest to catechists, to catechetical leaders, to Catholic school teachers, others who form people in the faith, from statements from our church to research studies that help us understand better how people learn and what their views are of God and church. I post all of those kinds of things there on my Facebook and Twitter accounts, so I invite you to connect there, and maybe we can continue this conversation even after this day and after this presentation. So the Catholic Church in the United States has a problem. We are shrinking at an alarming rate. 53% of the adults in the US leave the faith of their childhood, and only 9% leave and return. And just 30% of those raised Catholic even attend Mass once a month. 10% of all adults in the United States are ex-Catholics. And increasing evidence suggests that, contrary to popular belief, people aren't mostly leaving the church as young adults. 63% of people who left say that they stopped being Catholic between the ages of 10 and 17. And 23% say they left the faith before age 10. So people who are actually growing up in Catholic homes, maybe still attending Mass because their parents take them to Mass, still going to religious ed, have at least mentally and spiritually checked out. And they've said, this is really not for me. For many Catholics who leave the church, we aren't losing them in young adulthood. We're losing them much earlier. As a child and family psychologist who works a great deal with attachment and relationship during the childhood years, I'm very interested in why this happens and what we can do about it. The new directory for catechesis, the Universal Church's document on how to hand on the faith to others, encourages us to reflect on how information gleaned from human sciences like psychology and education can help us more effectively hand on the faith to others. In that spirit, I'd like to offer you 12 things that we can do to help our kids stay Catholic. But before I get to that, let's talk about the why. Why do so many young people leave the faith? When we ask them, here's what they tell us. 3 primary reasons. First, painful events. Now, your mind might be going to the widespread sexual abuse scandals in the church, and that certainly is one thing that our young people are concerned about. But for many, the painful events they're talking about here are something different. It's something that personally happened to them, whether that was at church or somewhere else. And when that something painful happened in their own lives, their faith didn't help them make sense of it. Perhaps they were offered pat answers about how it's all part of God's plan, or perhaps they found no answers at all. If faith can't help me in the most painful times of my life, they reasoned, what good is it at all? And that leads us to the second reason why young people say that they leave the church: a lack of connection between faith and daily life. We live in a highly secularized society that has struggled with how to be peaceful and respectful in a culture that's also increasingly pluralistic. We live with people who are not only Catholic, but other Christian faiths, other religions altogether, and people with no religion. And the unfortunate response has been to encourage a compartmentalization of faith. It's fine to worship as you see fit, but keep it within the church building on Sunday. Don't bring it out into the public square. And we've taken that message to heart, so much so that we've even lost the sense of how our faith forms and informs our daily experiences at home, at school, in the workplace. If our faith isn't connected to the places where we live most of our lives, what good is it anyway? And then third, they leave the church because they disagree with the church on one or more issues, or at least they think they do. We'll talk more about that in a few moments. As a catechist and as a psychologist, I think we can do better for our young people. I know we can, and we must if we want to see a thriving Catholic Church in the United States. But what's the solution? I'd like to propose 12 things we can do to help kids stay Catholic. Number one, start young. In her book, Forming Intentional Disciples, Sherry Waddell points out that the lack of attachment to one's childhood faith is particularly significant among Catholics. People grow up without being particularly attached to their faith, especially here in the United States. Many people have tried to explain that. There was a geneticist by the name of Dr. Dean Hammer who took a look at the difference between people that were highly religious and stayed involved with the religions that they grew up in and people that weren't particularly religious. And, if all you have is a hammer, everything is a nail. So if you're a geneticist and you're trying to solve a problem, you're going to look first at, well, is there a gene that causes that, right? He thought he found a gene that could explain the difference between people that were very religious and people that weren't. And by the way, there was some evidence that that brains of people who are very religious and people that aren't look different. So, it makes a little bit of sense, I guess, why he began kind of looking for that gene. What makes these brains look different, right? And he found a gene that he thought maybe could be responsible. It's called the VMAT2 gene. And if there really is a gene that makes some people religious and other people not, it makes some people attached to their faith and other people not, that's particularly problematic for us, isn't it, as Catholics and as catechists? Because that means that what we do doesn't really make all that much difference. What makes the difference is whether people have the gene or not. Well, you might be relieved to know there's no such thing as a God gene. You might have already guessed that, right? When other scientists looked at Dr. Hammer's data, they discovered that really his hypotheses really didn't explain anything at all. When they looked at the data, the VMAT2 gene doesn't really account for much difference at all between people that are very religious and people that aren't. That was Carl Zimmer's contribution. He was one who especially looked at those criticisms of Dr. Hammer's work. So what explains the differences in the brains between people that are very religious and people that aren't? And what explains the differences altogether between people that are attached to their faith and people that later seem to just kind of grow out of their faith? I'd like to offer, as a child and family psychologist, an alternative explanation. And the explanation is in the concept of attachment. The brain is very interesting in how it grows and changes. And different areas of the brain grow at different times. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But it's interesting to know that the attachment and relationship area of the brain is growing at its fastest in the first 5 or 6 years of life. This is when that part of the brain is most shapeable, most malleable. Neuropsychologists and neuropsychiatrists talk about this in terms of what they call neuroplasticity. At what ages are different areas of the brain most open to being shaped? And one example of that would be, for example, learning the sounds of a foreign language. If I wanted to learn a new language that had sounds that I had never made before, right now, as a middle-aged adult, I might be able to learn a lot of vocabulary in that language, but I would never speak it like a native speaker. I would always have what sounds like an accent in that language because I wouldn't be able to reproduce some of those sounds that are new to me. You've probably experienced this yourself before. And yet, if very young kids hear those sounds in a new language and learn the language while they're very young, they're able to speak the language almost like a native speaker. And this is a good example of the concept of neuroplasticity that I'm talking about here, because those language centers of the brain still have enough neuroplasticity that when you're young and you hear those new sounds, you're able to reproduce those new sounds. Well, attachment is kind of like that too. So the part of the brain that's responsible for attachment develops at its most rapid pace during those first 5 or 6 years of life, and it's mostly formed by the end of those 6 years. Now, does that mean that somebody who doesn't get attached to Jesus and the church in those first 5 or 6 years can't ever be attached? No, we don't believe that. We believe in God's grace, and also attachment is possible beyond those first 5 or 6 years of life. You know, one of the things that I do in my work as a child psychologist is I've worked with a lot of families that work with foster to adopt children. So, you know, they receive a child from the child welfare system, they're foster parents for a while, and then eventually they adopt that child. I always know that if they get that child in the first 5 or 6 years of life, that's going to make it easiest for that child to form a secure attachment to those new parents, especially kids that have never really been in an environment where they had a secure attachment, where they could really be safe, which is true of a lot of kids in the child welfare system. However, it's not impossible for kids who are a little older to attach. I just know that it's going to be a longer process, a less efficient process, and there are going to be more bumps in the road, and there are fewer guarantees for those kids. So if we extrapolate that to the idea of attachment to Jesus and the church, when is going to be the most efficient and effective time to attach kids to Jesus and the church? It's going to be in those first 5 or 6 years of life, when that attachment area of the brain is most shapeable, is most malleable. And yet, I consider this question: how many of our parishes have really good comprehensive faith formation offerings for preschool-age children? Maybe a few of them, right? But that's really not where we put most of our attention. And if a parish does have some faith formation for preschool-age children, what does it look like? Does it fit with their developmental needs? So is it a very hands-on active learning approach? And what is it about, right? Because what we're trying to do, remember, here at this age is facilitate that attachment to Jesus and the church. So if that preschool program looks like just, we'll focus on the topics of the children's liturgy of the word, we'll focus on those lectionary themes, or we're just going to do a bunch of kind of random Bible stories people stuck together and thought it might be nice to teach to kids. That's not going to be enough. We've got to be more intentional about that. A good faith formation program for preschool-age children that follows those intentional goals of attaching kids to Jesus and the church needs to be focused on the Jesus stories. You know, how can they get to know Jesus, both as a friend who welcomes them and as Lord? And then secondly, it needs to be focused on getting to know the parish as a community, as an extended family, a community that they're very much a part of right now, not just when they grow up. So that those preschool years need to be an introduction to Christ and the church. Secondly, we need to work towards family integrated catechesis. Children and teens are more likely to remain in the faith when they experience their faith as a primary source of joy and stability in their families. And so how are we supporting parents and families in cultivating that joy and stability that can come from an integration of their faith lives and their family lives? Families need accompaniment for this. They need some mentorship to learn how to do this well. And to do that, we want to pay attention to the developmental stages of family life. We think of developmental stages in terms of individual human persons, and certainly each human person has developmental stages that they go through, you know, from infancy to early childhood to middle childhood to adolescence to adulthood to middle adulthood to later adulthood. There are different stages of life that we go through as individuals. But families also go through developmental stages. Think about this. A family has this beginning stage when we're first getting together as couples. And then when that becomes a little more serious and we decide to really commit ourselves to one another. And then when we have children together, lots of things change when we have children together. If you're a parent, think back to the first child that you had, if you have more than one child, and how much that changed your life. Did that change your life a little bit? You know, some of you are laughing right now because you're thinking that, you know, everything about your life changed, right? Beginning with how much sleep you got, but also other things about your life, like what your priorities were, what things you did, you know, where you went as a family, the people that you spent the most time with. You probably went from mostly spending time with people that didn't have kids to mostly spending time with people that did have kids. Everything about a family's life changes when those kids come along. So this is a time of tremendous restructuring, and it's also a time of seeking support. People are less likely than they used to be to live near extended family. And they're also less likely than they used to be to have a bigger pool of close friends. Unfortunately, that's been one of the consequences of our more hectic pace of life and our more transient society, is that we're less likely to have a bigger pool of close friends. And so when people first have children, they're looking for that support network, and they're looking to build that for themselves. So what are we as parishes doing during those stages of life? Here's what I think we're often doing. We're preparing parents for baptism of that first child, and then we baptize that child, and then we say, you know, maybe in not these words, but the implication is there. Okay, see you later. It was nice meeting you. Come back in a few years. When your child is older, when they're school age, we'll enroll them in religious ed. We are missing this window of opportunity that could be the best time to help that family build that support network right there in the parish, to help the parish be the extended family for this family. What would happen if instead of doing that, we took the hand of this family at baptism and we never let go? What if we continued to walk with them? I think then by the time the kids got to be school age, by the time we were preparing them for the sacraments, we wouldn't have to say, but remember that you're your children's primary catechist, and so we need you to be very involved in their faith formation. We wouldn't have to say that because they'd already be involved. So pay attention to the developmental stages of family life. And then when parents and families are older and kids are school age, involve the family in the faith formation program. Give them lots of opportunities to be part of what's happening. Communicate between home and the parish religion program or the school religion program. And have some family-based faith formation sessions, some gatherings where parents and kids come together and learn together and share together. Finally, it's important to build a community that supports families in struggle and in crisis. Remember how many children say that they left the church, children and teens say that they left the church when they went through something painful and it seemed like their church had nothing to say about it, wasn't there for them in some way. And I think this is tragic, truly tragic, because our faith really helps us assign meaning to those harder experiences and to be able to work through them and still find a source of joy in our lives. We need to build communities that support families that are in struggle and in crisis. Number 3, use developmentally responsive catechesis to engage learners and avoid misunderstanding. So there's a long-running debate in the catechetical world that goes something like this, and we've heard this back and forth for decades. Is the content of our catechesis, having solid content, the most important thing? Or is it most important that our methodology be developmentally appropriate? And the church, in her wisdom, in the documents that have come out in catechesis, in the teaching that we've received, has definitively answered that question multiple times. We see a great extrapolation on this in St. John Paul II's Catechism Tradendae. And here's the answer that the church gives: yes and yes. The answer is these things aren't opposed to one another. They are both absolutely essential. We must have solid, authentic Catholic teaching, and we must deliver that in a way that's appropriate to the learner. What happens if we don't? What happens if we have good teaching, but we deliver it way over their heads or in some kind of inappropriate way? I hear some people sometimes say, well, they'll get it eventually, so go ahead and deliver it way over their heads. That's fine. Here's why it's not fine to do that. Because if we are teaching something that may be solid teaching, but we're teaching it in language that kids can't understand, they will walk away with a different understanding than what the church actually teaches. They will get it wrong. And the net result is, if we had taught them the wrong teaching. This is a phenomenon that I call heresy by methodology. Don't fall into the trap of heresy by methodology. We always have to use developmentally appropriate language and developmentally appropriate methods. And it's possible to do that and still make sure that always, always, always we are handing on authentic Catholic teaching. I want to talk a little bit about the scientific basis for a developmental approach. Back in the early 20th century, a Russian developmental theorist by the name of Lev Vygotsky hypothesized that there are zones of proximal development in kids' learning. And what he was trying to say there is that there are particular moments when kids are especially ready to learn a particular concept, and those moments would be those moments where it's still challenging and exciting to them because it's a little bit out of their reach, but they can do it with some support from a good teacher, from a good mentor. And he called this moment the zone of proximal development. Vygotsky would have said that if we introduce a concept before a child is in the zone of proximal development, it might be too challenging for them. It's over their head and it becomes frustrating. And so they develop an aversion to it, or they learn it wrong. If we deliver that content after we pass that zone of proximal development, it's not as exciting anymore. It feels a little babyish, even though it might be something new. We need to deliver those concepts right when we're in the zones of proximal development. So that was the theory. Now for the science, Dr. Bruce Perry, who's a child neuropsychiatrist, took a look at this concept in the terms of brain development, because years later, toward the end of the 20th century, we really got better and better at actually seeing the brain and seeing development in the brain. And what Dr. Perry noticed was the brain really does develop bottom to top in a stage-by-stage approach. So different areas of the brain develop at different times. I mentioned earlier that there's a particular time when the part of the brain that's responsible for attachment relationship is at its most malleable, its most shapeable. And that's true really of all of the brain. Different areas of the brain develop at different times. And so, in conjunction with that, there are particular times that kids are especially ready to learn particular concepts. And let me just give you an example here. There are two ages when kids are most likely, because of various developmental factors, to think of their adult selves, to imagine what kind of man or woman will I be when I grow up. One age isn't going to surprise you. It's age 17. Why would that be at age 17? Well, because they literally are almost a young man or a young woman, right? They're becoming 18. That's usually the age in our culture where we define adulthood. Lots of people are asking them, what are you going to do when you grow up? what are your plans for after high school? Those kinds of questions. So they're thinking a lot about that. Who will I be as a man or a woman? The other age when kids are most likely to think about this might surprise you a little bit, and it's age 11. Why age 11? Well, because this is a time when there's rapid physical growth in the body. Kids can't look in the mirror anymore at age 11 without realizing I am not going to be a little boy or a little girl forever. I am becoming something else. I'm growing into a man or I'm growing into a woman, right? So they naturally begin to think, what kind of man or what kind of woman will I be? There are also developmental windows when it comes to moral development, when it comes to thinking about the church as a community, and many, many other things that relate to cognitive, social, moral, and spiritual stages of development. We need to look for these windows of opportunity and capitalize on them. Because if we introduce topics of the faith right at the point where kids are ready to learn those topics of the faith, we'll be much more successful. So based on the example I just gave you, what would be the developmental window of opportunity? What would be the best zone of proximal development to introduce teaching about vocations? Well, it would be those 2 times when kids are thinking about what kind of man or what kind of woman will I be, right? So it makes sense that we would talk about vocations at age 17, and often we do. But how often do we talk about vocations at age 11? How many times do kids really hear a vocations talk from a priest and from a sister and from a married couple at age 11? That's exactly what we should be doing if we want to take advantage of this developmental window. Number 4, proclaim the kerygma. Proclaim the kerygma. The General Directory for Catechesis says, frequently many who present themselves for catechesis truly require genuine conversion. Because of this, the church usually desires the first stage in the catechetical process to be dedicated to ensuring conversion. In the context of new evangelization, it is effected by means of a kerygmatic catechesis, sometimes called pre-catechesis. Only by starting with conversion can catechesis, strictly speaking, fulfill its proper task of education in the faith. The new Directory for Catechesis that just came out this year reiterates this even in the preface and throughout the new directory. Kerygma is one of the most commonly used words, but in the preface to the new directory, it talks about how we shouldn't assume that the kerygma gives way to like a more solid and comprehensive catechesis, that actually nothing is more solid and comprehensive than the saving message of Jesus Christ. This isn't just the beginning. This is the continuation, that we need to keep unfolding this message, this saving message of the kerygma. And Pope Francis presents this very well in his apostolic exhortation, Christus Vivit. If you haven't read that document, I strongly encourage that you do. And one place I would especially point you to is the 4th chapter, where he really models how to present the kerygma to young people. And in that section, he really distills it into 3 sentences. Number 1, God loves you. Number 2, Christ saves you. And number 3, Christ is alive and wants you to be alive. That's a message that we can unpack in lots of different ways and present in lots of different ways. But it's the essential message, and until we fall in love with Jesus and with our faith, we don't care about all the other facts of the faith. And why is that? Let's think about that for a moment. I'm hoping that everybody listening to this has been in love at one time or another. And when you first fell in love, you might have had the experience of even having some phone conversations with the person that you were in love with, where you started the conversation with, so what are you doing? How was your day? What'd you do earlier? What are you going to do tomorrow? Why do we want to know all those details about somebody? We don't typically want to know all those details about people we're not that close to, right? About people that we don't love. We want to know those details about people we're in love with because we want to know everything about them, because we've fallen in love, right? And I think the same is true when it comes to how we're formed in our faith, right? Kids aren't going to want to know a lot of facts about Jesus and the church until they've fallen in love with Jesus and the church. So proclaim the gospel story often and offer an opportunity to respond to it. Offer your own personal witness and ask others to do the same. Let them know what it looks like to respond to the saving message of Jesus Christ. Number 5, integrate science and faith. Many young people feel a disconnect between faith and science. One of the common reasons that kids give for why they left the church is that they just didn't feel like the church and scientific truth were compatible with one another. What a shame, because the Catholic Church has had little disagreement with modern science. If you don't believe me, take a look at the Catechism, paragraph number 159. Historically speaking, the Church has been a patron of the sciences. And let me just give you a couple of examples. Georges Lemaitre, the physicist who developed the Big Bang Theory, he was a Catholic priest. Gregor Mendel, the father of genetics, he was an Augustinian friar, and the list goes on and on and on. Look this up, Catholic scientists and mathematicians. Just Google that and see what you find. And also, there's this false belief that that the church teaches against evolution or things like that. The church doesn't teach that Genesis 1 is meant to teach science. The Catholic Church has never had a problem with the theory of evolution. In 1950, Pope Pius XII proclaimed that there was no opposition between evolution and Catholic doctrine. What counts there, the theological position, of course, is that God created everything. God set it into motion, whether it happened by evolution or some other way. In 1996, St. John Paul II endorsed that statement of Pope Pius XII. Number 6, connect faith and everyday life. Never introduce a topic in catechesis without relating it back to the everyday life of the learner. We live in a highly secularized, compartmentalized society. And so our young people need help understanding, how does this thing I'm learning by faith fit with what I do and how I live out my everyday life? We'll need to not only talk about that and reflect on it, but also practice it, because practicing something makes us more likely to do it in everyday life. Number 7, cultivate mentoring relationships between adults and young people. There was a psychologist by the name of Dr. Emmy Werner, who her life's work was a 50-year study called the Hawaii Longitudinal Study. And what she looked at in that study was, why do some kids who start in the same place turn out one way and go down the wrong road? And why do some kids go on the right road, even though they might have also come from circumstances of great struggle and difficulty? She worked with a number of kids that were really at risk for going down the wrong road. And so I think her study is particularly relevant to us, because some of our worst fears, would have been realized in some of the risks for kids in this study. And what she found really made the difference. The single most important factor in ensuring that kids chose healthy paths that were good for them and avoided risky or self-destructive ones was the presence of strong mentors in their life. Research by the Fuller Youth Institute has really echoed this as well. Despite the age segregation that exists in our churches and in our broader culture, where teens and young people are separated even structurally from older people in the community, each young person is greatly benefited when they're surrounded by a team of 5 adults. Kids are much more likely to be Catholic when they get older if they've had 5 different adults in their lives who were strong examples of faithful Catholic disciples, right? And not just family members, but other mentors as well. This is called the 5-to-1 ratio, and it's borne itself out many times in the research literature. So what are we doing in our parish programs to really structure for that 5-to-1 ratio? How are we cultivating those relationships in the larger community? This is something we need to be thinking about. Number 8, don't forget the 3 transcendentals. Many people who have left the faith or become only marginally active in the faith have not had a meaningful encounter with God. Philosophers and theologians and others have pointed throughout history to 3 what they call transcendental properties of being, 3 things that make us look outside ourselves towards something higher, towards something bigger. And those 3 transcendentals are are truth, beauty, and goodness. Now, we live today in a world that questions whether truth can even exist anymore. It's very, the culture today is very skeptical that there's any objective truth at all. And so I think the most useful doors that we have towards this encounter with God, the most useful doorways we have then become beauty and goodness. When we see a beautiful work of art or a beautiful aspect of nature that just takes our breath away, that naturally points us to this idea there must be a God, because look at this beauty that I just can't explain, right? Or when we see someone who is so good, who is so self-giving, so loving, that it doesn't even make sense, we look at it and we say, why would somebody give of themselves so much? Why would they sacrifice in this unselfish way? And that naturally leads us toward God, toward the presence of God in their lives. Pope Francis says, think about this carefully, putting your stakes on the great ideals, the ideal of making a world of goodness, beauty, and truth. Bishop Robert Barron says, I affirm the path of truth and the path of beauty, but I also recommend as a means of propagating the faith, the third of the transcendentals, namely the good. Number 9, and this relates to that last one, the good, give them heroes. Kids look up to teens and young adults who are slightly older. There's this phenomenon in advertising today that you may or may not be familiar with, but you've probably seen examples of it. Have you ever seen commercials with toys and noticed that the kids playing with the toy just seem to be a lot older than what you would expect for kids that age to be playing with? So for example, you've looked at it and you've gone, hey, that 11-year-old playing with the Barbie dream house and having so much fun, my 11-year-old daughter or my 11-year-old niece wouldn't be interested in something like that. So you wonder, do these advertising agencies even know what's typical for kids this age? And the answer is they know exactly what they're doing. What the research has shown them is that if we really want to attract younger kids to something, we show kids that are slightly older doing it. Why? Because every kid wants to be a little bit older. The height of coolness for a young child, for say an 8-year-old child, is a child who's like 10 or 11. They're especially cool. A 25-year-old is probably already an elderly person for a lot of things. But the height of coolness is the child that's a little bit older. And so, we want to look for kids and teens at what examples can we give to them that are slightly older. So for those younger kids, saints like Saint Francisco and Jacinta Marto, the saints of Fatima, saints like Saint Dominic Savio, Blessed Imelda Lambertini. For older teens, Saint Clare of Assisi, Saint Therese of Lisieux. We want to look at folks like Saint Jose Sanchez del Rio, who died in his middle teenage years, Saint Dominic Savio. Give them those heroes they can really look up to. Kids today, their heroes are celebrities, they're athletes, they're influencers on social media, they're gamers, and one by one, those celebrities disappoint us. One by one, those heroes let kids down. True heroes wear halos. So give them true heroes. Give them the saints. Number 10, let them get involved and equip them to lead. In Christus Vivit, Pope Francis says, I want to state clearly that young people themselves are agents of youth ministry. Certainly they need to be helped and guided, but at the same time, left free to develop new approaches with creativity and a certain audacity. Pope Francis is saying here, let our young people not only be recipients of youth ministry, let them be agents of youth ministry. Let them be leaders. Sometimes we older people need to get ourselves out of the way a little bit and just support and accompany our young people in leading. How will they ever see a future for themselves in the church if they're never allowed to step up and be leaders? Pope Francis also says in Christus Vivit, there's a special need to accompany young men and women showing leadership potential so that they can receive training and the necessary qualifications. Let them be leaders. Number 11, focus on what makes us unique. Uniqueness builds brand loyalty. When you get really attached to a brand, it's because you see something about that that's different from anything else on the shelf, right? And I think Catholicism should be, presented in a similar way. So after kids fall in love with Jesus and the church, I think it's important for us to highlight, what does the Catholic Church have that no one else has? And so how do we help young people understand that? Things like Eucharist and the other sacraments, apostolic succession, the rich history that we find in our Catholic faith. Number 12, let them question. When young people get to the point where they're raising questions, doubts, even arguing with us about matters of the faith, we sometimes think, oh no, now they're going down this road towards leaving the church. But what if that's not what's happening? What if they're actually beginning this struggle so that they can get to a deeper place in their faith, so that they can really make what used to be their parents' faith their own, right? How many of us have never had question? How many of us have never struggled with issues of faith? I would propose that if you've never had questions, if you've never struggled with issues of faith, then perhaps you haven't really yet become an intentional disciple. Maybe you need to dive deeper into your faith, because faith is something we ought to wrestle with, that we ought to challenge ourselves with, right? And if our young people are asking questions, at least they're engaged. When they're no longer engaged, they're not asking questions anymore. When they're questioning, we need to listen. Don't shut them down or offer oversimplified answers. There's one answer with 3 words that can be great when kids ask the really tough questions. And that answer is, I don't know. I don't know, but that's a good question. Let's keep talking about that. Let's figure it out together. Let me do a little research, right? Invite them to continued conversation. Let them know that you will walk with them. Kids and teens really want to know that they belong. And it's important to let them know that even people that are struggling, that are questioning, that are doubting, belong with us. You're still part of us. Keep walking with us. Let's figure this out together. Thank you again for listening to this talk, and I invite you again to connect with me through my website at sharingcatholicfaith.com and through social media. May God bless you, and thank you so much for your ministry.